I'll never forget the day I realized that my salary, the paycheck I worked tirelessly for, was significantly lower than that of my colleagues. It was a hot afternoon in July, and the office had a strange stillness to it. The usual buzz of phones and keyboards seemed far away as I sat at my desk, staring at the numbers on the screen that didn't add up. I had been promoted just 6 months earlier, and yet, it felt like my efforts were being devalued in a way that I couldn't articulate at the time. The first time I brought it up to my manager, his response was dismissive, cloaked in the patronizing tone that I had come to know all too well. "You're doing great. These things take time," he said, flashing a half-hearted smile before quickly changing the subject. My heart sank. Was it my imagination? Was I expecting too much too soon? Over time, I started noticing the subtle ways in which I was being passed over, not just for equal pay but for equal respect. Meetings I should have led were given to my white colleagues. Ideas I proposed were met with lukewarm reception until someone else presented the same thing, only for it to be praised as brilliant. I was invisible in rooms where my work was front and center, and yet I wasn't seen. This wasn't just about a paycheck, it was about power, dignity, and recognition. But the wage gap, that tangible number that proved I wasn't imagining it, was what hit the hardest. The first awakening. It wasn't until one of my closest colleagues, Maria, who was hired around the same time as me, accidentally let slip what she earned, that I realized the full extent of the disparity. Maria was a lovely person, kind, hardworking, and supportive, but she didn't face the same systemic challenges that I did. As a Latina woman, she was also fighting her own battles against discrimination, but when she offhandedly mentioned her salary over lunch one day, I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. She was earning nearly 20% more than I was, despite the fact that we had the same role and similar levels of experience. My heart sank. It was no longer a suspicion, it was reality. I went home that night and cried. Not just for the money I wasn't earning but for the way my hard work, my dedication, and my talents seemed invisible in the eyes of the people who controlled my career. I had worked late nights, weekends, and taken on extra projects, thinking that it would lead to the recognition and compensation I deserved. But instead, I felt like I was being punished for being who I was, a black woman in a world that wasn't designed for me to succeed. The historical weight. It wasn't just my story. I knew that. My experience was part of a much larger narrative, one that spanned generations of black women fighting to be seen and valued in a system that had been designed to exclude us from the start. The wage gap for black women has always been wider than for most other groups, with studies consistently showing that we make only 63 cents for every dollar that white men earn. That's not just a statistic, that's the difference between financial security and constantly living paycheck to paycheck. I thought about my mother, who had worked as a nurse for over 30 years, and how she had always told me that I would have to work twice as hard to get half as far. She wasn't wrong. But even knowing that didn't soften the blow of realizing how deeply entrenched the pay disparity was in my own life. My mother's sacrifices had shaped me into the strong woman I had become, but they had also left me with an understanding of the injustices that black women have always faced in the workplace. Her hands were worn and her back was tired from years of caregiving, but her spirit was resilient. She had raised me to believe that I could achieve anything if I worked hard enough. And I had, at least, I thought I had. But sitting at that lunch table with Maria, I felt the sting of a system that had never truly been in my favor. The fight for fairness. After my revelation with Maria, I started to dig deeper. I spoke to other women in the office, carefully navigating the taboo topic of salaries. What I found was devastating. Almost all the women of color were being paid less than their white counterparts. We all shared similar stories, being passed over for promotions, given menial tasks, and having our contributions overlooked. But no one seemed willing to rock the boat. I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. At first, I approached human resources, naively believing that the issue could be resolved through internal channels. I laid out the numbers, showing clear evidence of the pay gap between myself and my colleagues. I was met with thinly veiled excuses, ranging from budgetary constraints to performance metrics, none of which explained why I was being compensated less for the same work. Days turned into weeks and still nothing changed. The conversations I had with HR became repetitive and exhausting, each one ending with promises to look into it. But the truth was clear, they weren't going to fight for me. If anything was going to change, I would have to fight for myself. Speaking out and stepping up. I began researching labor laws, reading up on equal pay legislation, and connecting with other women who had gone through similar struggles. I found strength in the stories of those who had fought and won. The more I learned, the more determined I became to take action. I started documenting everything: emails, conversations, performance reviews, anything that could support my case. The emotional toll of this process was immense. I struggled with feelings of inadequacy, wondering if maybe I wasn't worth as much as my colleagues. Every time I confronted the issue, I was met with resistance, and I began to question if I was making things worse for myself. My mental health suffered. I became withdrawn, isolated, and unsure of how to move forward. But there was a part of me that refused to give up. My ancestors hadn't given up, and neither would I. Black women before me had fought to break through barriers far higher than this one. My pain was real, but so was my determination to change the narrative, not just for myself, but for the generations of Black women who would come after me. I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in employment discrimination, and together we began the long, grueling process of filing a formal complaint against my employer. I felt both empowered and terrified. This was my livelihood on the line, and retaliation was a very real possibility. But I knew that if I didn't take a stand, nothing would change, not for me, and not for the other Black women who would come through those doors in the future. Let's continue with the price of justice. The legal process was draining. It took months of back-and-forth negotiations, and at times I felt like I was fighting an invisible enemy. My case wasn't just about money anymore, it was about being treated as an equal, as someone whose contributions mattered just as much as anyone else's. In the meantime, the work environment became toxic. I could feel the tension whenever I walked into a room, and I knew that people were talking about me behind my back. Colleagues who had once been friendly became distant, as if they didn't want to be associated with someone who was causing trouble. I began to wonder if I was doing the right thing. But every time I considered backing down, I thought about the women who had paved the way for me, the ones who had been denied opportunities, who had been silenced, and who had suffered in silence. I thought about my mother, and how she had fought for dignity in a world that didn't see her. I owed it to her, and to myself, to keep fighting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a settlement was reached. It wasn't the victory I had hoped for, there was no public acknowledgement of the injustice, no sweeping changes to company policy, but it was something. My salary was adjusted, and I received back pay for the years I had been underpaid. A new chapter. In the end, I left that company. The fight had taken too much out of me, and I knew that staying there would never allow me to heal. But the battle had taught me something invaluable: my worth wasn't defined by a paycheck. My value couldn't be measured by the opinions of others or by a system that wasn't designed for me to succeed. I had fought for myself, and in doing so, I had paved the way for others to do the same. The wage gap for Black women is still a harsh reality, but change is happening, slowly but surely. More women are speaking out, more companies are being held accountable, and more of us are realizing that we don't have to settle for less. The road ahead is long, but I'm hopeful that one day, we'll reach a place where equal pay is a reality, not a dream. My story is just one of many. But together, our stories form a chorus that can't be ignored. We are here, we are worthy, and we won't stop fighting until we are seen, heard, and valued in the ways we deserve. Equal pay. Equal power. The road to healing. Leaving that company marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, but the scars from the battle I had fought remained. It wasn't just the wage gap that had taken its toll, it was the emotional and psychological weight of constantly feeling less than, unseen, and undervalued. As much as I had achieved some level of justice, I knew I needed to heal. I couldn't move forward carrying the anger, frustration, and exhaustion that had built up over years of being overlooked. The first step was admitting that I couldn't do it alone. I sought therapy, something I had been hesitant about in the past. Growing up, mental health wasn't a topic we discussed in my household, and there was always this unspoken rule that we, as Black women, were supposed to be strong enough to handle everything on our own. But the truth was, I was tired of being strong. I needed help. I needed someone to help me unpack everything I had been through, not just at work but throughout my life, the systemic barriers, the microaggressions, and the quiet, constant erosion of my self-worth. Finding my strength again. Therapy was a game changer for me. It gave me the tools to process the hurt, but more importantly, it helped me rediscover my voice. For so long, I had silenced myself, doubting my worth and questioning whether I deserved to take up space. My therapist helped me challenge those thoughts and guided me in reclaiming my power. It was a slow process, but week by week, I started to feel more grounded, more confident. I began to understand that my value wasn't tied to anyone's perception of me, it came from within. At the same time, I started joining support groups specifically for women of color who had faced workplace discrimination. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone, and it was incredibly healing to be part of a community of women who understood my pain in a way no one else could. We shared advice, offered encouragement, and celebrated each other's wins, no matter how small. These women became my lifeline, my source of strength when I felt like giving up. I also began to focus on self-care in ways I hadn't before. I started journaling regularly, getting back into hobbies I had neglected, and setting boundaries in my life. I learned to say no without guilt, to prioritize my mental and emotional well-being above everything else. It wasn't easy, and I still had moments where the weight of it all would creep back in, but I was learning how to manage it, how to protect my peace. Professional growth and empowerment. After leaving my previous job, I was determined to not only find a workplace where I was valued, but also to advocate for other women who might be going through similar struggles. I became involved in activism around pay equity and workplace discrimination, attending seminars, speaking on panels, and even mentoring younger women who were just starting their careers. It was empowering to use my experience to uplift others, to turn my pain into purpose. Professionally, I made it a point to research potential employers more thoroughly, looking for companies that had a track record of supporting diversity and inclusion. During interviews, I wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions about pay transparency, equity, and the company's stance on advancing women of color in leadership roles. I knew my worth and I refused to settle for less than what I deserved. This time, I wasn't going to be passive, I was going to advocate for myself from the start. Eventually, I found a new job with a company that aligned with my values. They were transparent about salaries, offered opportunities for growth, and most importantly, treated me with respect. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was seen, not just as a worker, but as a person with talents, ambitions, and value. The experience was validating, and it reinforced what I had learned through my journey. I had the power to change my circumstances. The book that changed everything. While therapy, support groups, and my own determination played a huge role in my transformation, there was one resource that became a turning point for me, a book titled Equal Pay, Equal Power, Closing the Wage Gap for Black Women. A friend from one of my support groups had recommended it to me, and I picked it up out of curiosity. I wasn't expecting it to be the game changer that it was, but it turned out to be exactly what I needed. The book was more than just an exploration of the wage gap. It offered practical, actionable steps for navigating the corporate world as a Black woman, from negotiating salaries to advocating for oneself in the workplace. But what really struck me was how deeply it resonated with my own experience. The stories, the strategies, it felt like the author had written it just for me. For the first time, I had a roadmap, a set of tools that empowered me to not just survive in the workplace but thrive. I started applying the steps outlined in the book, everything from conducting research on salary ranges in my industry to crafting a compelling case for my value when negotiating raises. It gave me the confidence to walk into rooms with my head held high, knowing that I deserve to be there just as much as anyone else. If anyone watching this video is struggling like I did, feeling undervalued, underpaid, and unsure of how to advocate for yourself, I urge you to grab a copy of Equal Pay, Equal Power: Closing the Wage Gap for Black Women. This book transformed my life, and I believe it can do the same for you. It's more than just a guide, it's a lifeline for Black women who are ready to claim their worth. You can get a digital copy at libriffy.com, just follow the link in the description. Don't wait. Your future is worth fighting for.